Hey guys, this is the topic analysis for policy affirmatives for September-October. This is going to be examining my initial list of plan AFFs that you guys could research and write on this topic. Bear in mind that this is by no means an exhaustive list of the policy affirmatives that are available. These are simply the AFFs that I thought would have the most topic lit, or that I'd seen before, or that I thought were cool and sort of speculated on, or that you guys came up with in the group chat. This is going to be distinct from Rafi's in that it is mostly about policy AFFs, and we're going to talk a little bit about what advantages tie in. But if you want to think about the generic util impacts / internal links, that's why you go look at Rafi's analysis. So, this general overview is sort of my first impressions / general thoughts about how you should approach the plan writing process of the topic. The first major idea I had is that I personally think that defending whole res is either incoherent or completely strategically unfeasible on this topic. The first reason being is that there are just too many types of national service that would be defended under the umbrella of whole res. The first one that everyone thinks of course, is the military, but then you have other programs like the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps or a ton of other federal programs. And depending on what T definition you use, how national service gets to be defined can include a broad range of things. And the problem is that, of course, that opens up to a ton of disad links that we may not be prepared to defend. Sure, we could probably frontline the common disads to common programs, like, say, a disad to a military draft or to the Peace Corps or whatever. But if someone pops some weird disad on us about some vague program that's under the umbrella of whole res that we didn't know about, that is something that we could have very easily avoided. The next reason I think defending whole res is incoherent is because there are a ton of legal nuances on the concept of compulsory service that probably should be clarified via a plan text. Otherwise, the debate becomes very muddled and unhelpful. The first question, of course, is who has to serve? Traditionally, when we think of like a military draft, we would think of 20-something college kids going to military for, say, 2 years and then coming back. However, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and who we defend to go into the military can affect what advantage ground is available to us / what disad links are available to the neg. Likewise, the question of how long is also especially important. I've read articles about how draftees who aren't in the military long enough are not properly trained, so they actually make for worse soldiers than, say, an all-volunteer army would. So how long we have people stay in could also affect certain advantages and disad links. But that question is also not just relevant for the military. One of the plans I'm talking about later, Teach for America, will also have a time-relevant question. Then, of course, there's the problem I just discussed, what programs are we going to defend? It would seem, at least in my mind, pretty unstrategic to defend the broad scope of national service programs that are in the United States. And so it would seem necessary for us to pick one, or at least a couple, in order to have a proper debate. The next caveat, of course, about defending whole res is that it probably opens us up to too many good plan-inclusive counterplans, i.e., if we were to defend the broad scope of national service, someone could probably identify one problematic, or at least identify one problematic for national service, and then just simply pick out of that, and we'd have no way to predict which program they want to pick out of, what ground they have available to them to pick out of. So that's my other major concern about defending whole res. Yes, we would have 1AR theory as a recourse, but that is probably still not the most ideal situation to be in regarding whole res if we're expecting to read 1AR picks bad every time. So, therefore, I think finding specific policies and plans is probably the best way to go on this topic. The other major thing you should therefore have to consider is think about which plans would be best suited to answer a generic K. Ahmet probably correctly pointed out that a ton of the util AFFs on this topic bite very hard into some critiques. So you should keep that in mind. Think about which plan texts hedge best against a generic critique, or at least which plan texts have advantage areas that allow you to hedge against generic Ks. This would be like plans that can generate structural violence advantages in addition to maybe traditional big stick advantages. Now, the other major caveat I want you to think about is the distinction between military and civil service. If you were to look up the word draft in Google, or maybe even just the word national service, sorry, I have a cold. If you were to look up those terms, you'll probably get a ton of hits for military-based service. However, that's definitely not the full scope of the topic literature regarding national service as how we would generically think of it. There are tons of literature about non-military based programs that people serve in, such as the Peace Corps, that you guys should definitely be doing research into. Because if you're only doing military-based research, that wouldn't help us answer any sort of civil service-based plans other people write. And B, those other plans might just be more strategic, given that everyone is expecting to debate a military service plan, and will probably have a good case neg against those types of plans, which probably increases the strategic value of civil service programs. So just make sure that your research isn't limited to just military service. There's tons of other good lit about non-military stuff that you guys should definitely be looking into. Okay, so now into the specific plans. So the first one is probably the most common one you're going to find, and it's about the military draft. You'll notice if you start researching the military draft, there's one name that will probably keep popping up. His name is Charles Rangel. He's a Democratic congressman from New York, and he's been pushing the draft in Congress for several years now. He's brought up the same sort of bill in multiple different sessions of Congress for I think over a decade now. So the draft so you should look into what his bill specifically does. Maybe we can see if his bill is a good model for a plan text. And there's going to be quite a few articles writing about his bill because it was brought up in Congress. So the draft can have both big stick and structural violence type advantages. There is literature that indicates that it appears to be poor minorities who are largely targeted for military service in the all-volunteer force, which the argument then would be that a draft would serve sort of like an equalizer for racial or class relations in the military. The other advantages, or in terms of big stick impacts, could revolve around things like military readiness and hegemony. The scenarios would probably involve along the lines of military personnel being overstretched or overburdened in terms of being able to project influence, and as a result, we're not able to properly respond to certain situations that may arise in certain conflict zones. There's also a concept in the literature called the, quote, civil-military gap. It's basically a situation where civilians, because they are no longer drafted into the military, don't really have a stake in military affairs, so they don't really end up caring about what happens to the military. A lot of authors speculate that this sort of growing apathy is the reason why a war like Vietnam, which lasted over a decade and had hundreds of thousands of casualties, had such vehement anti-war protests, but wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, which lasted a comparable amount of time, did not have that same kind of anti-war protest because of that civil-military gap. Because in Vietnam, we had a draft, but for Iraq and Afghanistan, we had an all-volunteer force. So some authors therefore speculate that a draft would bridge this gap by ensuring everyone had some stake in military affairs. The logic being that if you are in the draft, or if you know someone who is in the draft, say a family member, then you have a personal incentive to care about what politicians do with our military. The breadth of the topic literature on this specific plan means that there's a ton of different opportunities for more intricate plans, and so the strategy will probably revolve around picking the best policy to be part of the AFF strategy. There are a ton of disad links and potential picks out of problems that the military has. For example, the Trump transgender ban is a big subject in the news right now, and will probably be the subject of a pick, say, military draft, except for those who identify as transgender individuals. I know from reading that there's also a severe problem with homophobia in the military, so that could also be part of a pick. So that means that we need to very carefully think about how we're going to approach this type of plan and what specific text we're going to pick. Alright, the next plan, and this is one I actually researched personally as a camper at PDI 2016, it's about Teach for America. Teach for America is a program where recent college grads will teach in schools, like elementary or middle schools or even high schools in low-income areas. The idea is that if you put successful college graduates in struggling areas with kids who are struggling in school, then not only do they have the expertise to teach courses that maybe the usual teachers aren't trained enough to teach, because a lot of teachers in public schools today don't actually have a degree in what they're teaching the kids. But not only that, but the success of these college grads will sort of serve as like a beacon of inspiration for these kids. And so they'll be more inspired to succeed in school and go to a good school and lead a better life. So the specific spin I took on this plan at camp was model minority framing. I read some research about how model minority stereotypes negatively affect certain Asian American groups. If you don't know what the model minority stereotype is, it's basically a stereotype about Asian Americans where people look at, say, Chinese or Korean or Japanese students and see how well they do in school and how well they do in the professional space, and sort of generalize that to all Asians and say, oh, all Asians are good test takers, or all Asians are super smart workers. And the criticism of this framing is that there are, of course, not only some Asian Americans that or some Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans that don't necessarily succeed in that way, but also several other Asian American groups, such as Vietnamese, Cambodian, Indonesian, that don't necessarily fit that model, and often struggle in school as a result, because they're not only expected to succeed more than their peers, but when they fail to do so, they're not really helped because they're expected to be able to succeed. So the articles I read about for this specific plan revolved around how, like, Teach for America teachers were able to help students who came from poor Asian backgrounds and were able to sort of inspire them to work harder and to be able to actually succeed in school. But of course, that's the one advantage I researched in particular. Teach for America could also probably have your generic race advantages about helping low-income kids. So there is tons of structural violence ground open for this particular plan. There also could potentially be some basic advantage based off of this, based on the competitiveness of the U.S. education system and its ability to generate workers that will drive our technological competitiveness. But I haven't really read that literature, so I'll be interested to know if we end up picking this plan, what we end up doing with this. Okay, so the next non-military plan that I had in mind involves the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is probably one of the more famous programs that forms of national service that is non-military. So for those of you who don't know, the Peace Corps is a program that sends people overseas to provide technical and developmental assistance to other countries. It was founded by the Kennedy administration in the 60s, and the people who usually go are like college grad age kids who want to sort of make a change in the world. They are sent to usually countries that are struggling to provide economic or developmental assistance. Advantage areas could include economic development and the protection of U.S. soft power. For those of you who don't know what soft power is sort of the influence the United States is able to project via its culture or its image in the world. It's distinct from hard power. Hard power would generally involve like military power or physical force. So soft power would tie in with the Peace Corps very well, because if other countries perceive that the United States is sending its best and its brightest to sort of help those who are struggling most in the world, that improves the ability of the U.S. to sort of influence international relations. Likewise, economic development. There's some literature that indicates that countries that have lower rates of economic development tend to lash out more because they try to obtain resources or simply need to appease their populations if they're constantly poor or struggling. So the idea would be that we have force people to serve in the Peace Corps, send them abroad, and it would improve the status of the Peace Corps as, say, a toolkit in America's IR arsenal. There's also a spin-off to the Peace Corps that I saw at camp that I thought was really cool. It revolves around returned Peace Corps volunteers. So when you go serve in the Peace Corps, you'll eventually come back, say, after 1 or 2 years. So this specific plan, and I've included the site that talks about this the most, that's the Majeski site, it revolves around the idea that people who have returned from their initial service, who want to serve, who are entered into sort of a system where they are sent abroad again. The idea being is that these people who have already served one mission will have the training and the expertise to be able to work in other areas. Because a common criticism of the Peace Corps is that it sends people who are not necessarily trained or equipped to handle different cultures into areas where they may be certain sensitivities regarding certain actions or ideas, and as a result they end up being very ineffective. So this plan would solve that by sending the people who already have expertise and who have had that training to go abroad to do those things. Okay, this one is about medical service. I actually have not read that much literature about this, but you guys were talking about this in the group chat, and I thought it was a cool policy idea. So this is basically a policy about sending doctors into either low-income areas in America or to developing countries abroad to provide hard-to-obtain medical treatments. This is both structural violence and basic impacts. Structural violence is, I think, pretty obvious, helping low-income or certain racial or certain minorities obtain medical care that would otherwise be inaccessible to them. Basic advantages could revolve around, say, disease impacts, about what could happen in terms of disease outbreaks if certain areas are continually left untreated. The foreign policy impact could also be similar to the Peace Corps plan. This is one that I, like I said earlier, haven't read too much about, but I sort of, when you guys mentioned it, I really like the idea about. There's also good literature about the concept of medical diplomacy, which means that there is tons of viable advantage ground. It's just a question of finding probably a good solvency advocate or plentex. Okay, for the last few minutes, I just want to talk about one-off plans that I either found a small amount of literature on, or that I think would be good, small plans to maybe break in deep elims where we just need a one-off plan to win a quarters or a semis round. There may be more literature to these than I'm granting them, but this is just sort of my general thoughts. The first one is about cyber war conscription. There's this good article that I put in the Dropbox. I believe it's the Clark 10 evidence that talks about conscripting cyber industry experts into sort of the defense field to serve in the event of a cyber attack. So basically, we would take a bunch of tech people who are in the tech industry and have them sort of serve as a cyber defense unit in the event we believe that there's a potential for a cyber attack, or to serve as maybe full-time members of the defense of our defense as a cyber task force. And the main advantage, of course, would be about cyber attacks. There's a ton of literature into especially recent literature on the idea of cyber attacks and how they can affect our military planning, our infrastructure. So there's definitely a good advantage area here. It's just a question of is this plan viable, and is there more literature than just the one Clark 10 evidence that I put in the Dropbox for you guys. Another plan text that you guys discussed in the group chat revolved around rehabilitating prisoners. So in this case, we would have ex-convicts spend some time doing service after they were released or maybe even while they're in prison, as a form of rehabilitation. This has probably fantastic structural violence scenarios, since there's a lot of literature about what happens to a lot of ex-convicts once they leave prison and are unable to reintegrate into the workforce. There could be scenarios where not only do they gain skills that they can re-enter the workforce with, but also they gain this new perception, or like national service would destigmatize their reputation as ex-convicts in the eyes of the public, which would make it easier for them to reintegrate and to return to normalcy. This next plan is actually really cool, and it's one I debated at PDI 2016 that someone else wrote. It's about Native American heritage. It's a plan that requires people to serve to restore Native American heritage sites. There's one specific program involving, I believe, the CNCS that does this. And so there could be some really good critical framing with this plan about, say, Native American relations or some sort of spin on give back the land framing that would that could serve as an advantage area as well. So the idea would be that if you serve to restore Native American heritage sites, it raises awareness about the sort of injustice that was dealt to Native Americans, as well as sort of a rectification for current Native American discrimination, because there is also literature present about how Native Americans have their material affairs are in a worse state than the rest of the population. Like, they live in worse places than the rest of the population. So this plan would sort of serve as a rectification for that. Now, this last one I want to talk about is one that is very much out there, and sort of one that I was very hesitant to include because I'm not entirely sure if it makes for a viable plan. But it's one that was based off of an article I read a couple days ago, and that I thought could derive some really cool advantage areas off of if we could, write the plan properly and research it properly. It involves congressional service. There's an article I read that indicates that current reps and senators in the U.S. Congress have been discovered to be extremely understaffed, or the staff they do have are not capable of executing the functions that congressmen or women need. Which is problematic because that sort of leads to the gridlock that we constantly see in the news. It prevents adequate function of Congress, and a paralyzed Congress is probably not a good thing for multiple reasons. There are probably scenarios involving specific bills not happening. So you could basically make a politics dissent into an advantage off of this. Also, another idea I had was that if you were forced to serve as part of the political process, it would make you more civically engaged and sort of increase voter participation or general political awareness. And there are scenarios regarding civic engagement and what happens when most of the population is turned off of politics. But like I said, this is probably more of an out there plan, and this would probably be lower on the priority list for us to write. But I just wanted to include this because when I saw it, I was kind of excited, and also because I just want to see what you guys do with this list. So those are all the plans I had personally. You guys should you guys definitely shouldn't limit your thinking to just this. As a general tip for researching plans, you should always be changing up your search terms in Google to find more nuanced portions of the topic literature, but also be sure to check out the footnotes of articles. Oftentimes there will be a specific policy that's talked about in the body of an article that's talked about more extensively in one of the articles with footnotes. But also, if you are looking for a plan and you aren't finding one, don't get discouraged. Most plans are stumbled across by chance, and the only way you find that and have that happen is to just keep looking. So that concludes the policy AFF topic analysis. I wish you all luck in researching, and good luck in the rest of the season.